Hello, everyone. Welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joe Bouchard, a graduate student in education. And with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, professor of English and philosophy, as well as our first ever special guest on the show, Mr. Ian Gayford, who is an educator like his father and a villain enthusiast. Last week, we had a detailed discussion about what constitutes a hero. It'd be easy to dismiss villains as the mere antithesis of heroes, but this doesn't do them justice. No pun intended. The philosophical examination of villains doesn't yield inverse answers to the same questions we asked with heroes. Villains come with their own idiosyncratic questions, leading us to not only draw contrasts and parallels, but to try and understand them in their own context. All right, Ian, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I mentioned wanting to do villains to Norm first, and he said,
Yes.
"Yeah, that'd be cool, but can we do heroes first? Because I think Ian would really want to discuss villains with us." So what is it about villains that you're drawn to?
I think that villains are some of my earliest memories of anything pop cultural, and I'm not exactly sure what the genesis point of that is, but the very first villain that I remember really enjoying is, I don't remember how old I was, but Mom and Dad sat down and we watched an old Disney film called The Black Cauldron. And it was an animated film from I believe it was the early 80s, if I'm not mistaken. And it was based on a series of young adult books. And there was the villain of the piece was named the Horned King. And I was always kind of drawn to different kinds of music, especially soundtracks, because that's kind of what Dad would play in the car when we were driving anywhere. So that's some of my earliest musical memories. And the Horned King had this wonderfully dramatic entrance point in the film, and he had this very, very stately, evil minor key theme, and I went, "Oh, that's cool." And John Hurt was the voice actor, and he gave this really eerie, creepy performance. The Horned King is a zombie-like person, and I just thought, wow, this is cool. And he's way more interesting than the the young kid who was basically the hero, the protagonist of the story. So from that point on, I just kind of always gravitated towards the villains. Another one of those early points of memory for me was the first time I saw Star Wars, and the first time I saw Darth Vader whip out his red lightsaber. And then I learned that all the villains had the red lightsaber, and I went, "Oh, I want the red lightsaber. The red lightsaber is cool." So I guess I just found them more interesting, and to be honest, that has continued, and I still really find villains a little bit more interesting than the nominal heroes of stories for the most part, especially in pop culture.
Yeah, it's villains. They're definitely interesting, and in a way that is in stark contrast to the heroes. You know, you're a music teacher,
Yes.
and I play some music, and it's the kind of thing where, a lot of pop music is focused on major keys and that sort of thing. And so you hear a minor key, you hear the Imperial March or something like that. You go,
Yes,
"Oh, this is
yes.
way different," especially as a small child.
Yes.
So yeah, there's everything about villains. From pop cultural elements, their soundtracks, their appearances, their demeanors. It all is pretty interesting stuff. So at the end of our last show with heroes, I asked Norm to give me some of his favorite heroes. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm not going to spring it on you. So I'll ask you the questions now, and then at the end of the episode, I want to hear you guys answer. But
Okay.
I'm going to ask you, who is your favorite good villain and bad villain? Now, what I mean by that is, who is the villain that you love to hate, and who is the villain that you hate to love? So be thinking about that, and then at the end of the episode, I'll circle back to it, and we'll see who we have.
Very good.
So let's start out with the essence. What is a villain?
Can we do with the etymology? And because I think that this is really interesting.
Yeah.
So villain comes from medieval Latin, villainus, and essentially it's associated with Older Latin, with the inhabitant of a villa. So it's associated with a large country dwelling, it's associated with the land. And then, of course, in medieval times, people who had large country dwellings were people who generally lorded it over others. And so it began to accrue that power association. But it basically means villager. Often the words associated with it are rustic and scoundrel and peasant and farmer. And so it has accrued massive barnacles of emotive association over the centuries.
Right. And so what that kind of tells us, just based on the language alone, is that the concept of a villain has sort of been with us for a long time, right? And it's kind of morphed and changed as time has gone on. So if you were to give us the etymology is great, and that shows us that, like, okay, well, the origin of the word is interesting in itself. How would you describe a villain as we modernly conceive of it?
And you want to go with that first?
Sure. So I think that people tend to have this conception of the villain as basically someone who is evil, someone who is placed in the world of a story or the world of characters in order to give them a hard time. Or, a lot of times now in pop culture, the villain has a plan. So they have a plan to do something, and it's usually something bad. And so they really are defined by their opposition to the protagonist or the hero. And we could talk about this. I think we'll talk about it later, but I think it's interesting when villains sort of depart from that formula too. But I think that usually we conceive of them as somebody who's just kind of like this evil person who is in opposition to whatever our heroes are doing.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good start. Norm, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, if you're talking about our current context and what Ian said makes the foundation for that. What's interesting is that we have, I think now, an awareness of villains, and mine has grown over the decades too, because I used to eschew the idea of liking the villains, which was absolutely ridiculous. I was trying to be this moralistic dad. And I look back at it and say, what was I doing, because I knew better? But anyway, villains are theater teaches us. Villains don't always think of themselves as villains. As Ian said, they have a plan. They have something they want to do. They're responding to something. They want to change the way the world is, whatever the world means, whatever layer of world we're talking about. But they don't necessarily think that what they're doing is wrong. They often realize that it's in contrast to standard operating procedures and moral norms and such. But so the villain who's just bad for the sake of being bad is not always uniformly with us the way it may have been in my youth. So much so that it's interesting that the Vatican, with the Star Wars films, was having real trouble with Kylo Ren. I was reading about this week. I hadn't realized this because they don't think that the elements in the Vatican did not think that evil was pronounced enough in the later Star Wars films.
Huh. That's funny. Yeah, I didn't know that either. So let's ask this question. You and I talked about heroes last week.
Yeah.
Are heroes and villains separated by more than perspective or narrative?
I think that in a traditional sense, the heroes have often been the supporters of the status quo. truth, justice, and the American way was Superman in the 50s, and then truth, justice, and the human way is what it ended up being in the movies, and that's a great big shift. But it's still okay. We that implies that we know what justice is. That implies that we know what truth is, and by the thunder, we just know exactly what's supposed to be right. And I don't think that there's this absolute antithesis with villains, because I don't think that. I mean, if you define villainy as just opposing the status quo, then any of us who take a stand about social justice issues in whatever small ways we might would be considered villains. And of course, there are people who would say that we are. Anyway, Ian, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I was interested because I think sometimes the reverse is true as well. So if we go back to Star Wars, the Empire in the original trilogy is the status quo, right? And so the rebels, the new Jedi represented by Luke Skywalker, and Leia, they're fighting against that status quo. And so you have the reverse image as well. Or if you take I just left my head. But if you like a film like Willow, okay, so from 1988, 1989, you've got this evil, again, it's sort of very similar to Star Wars in some respects. You've got this evil kingdom led by an evil queen, kind of like the emperor figure in Star Wars. And you've got small people trying to, small and not in terms of, well, a little bit in terms of stature, but also in terms of, they're not these institutional forces, but they're banding together to fight against a larger villainous quote unquote force. So I think it goes both ways. In terms of it being separate, in terms of the things being separated by other things other than perspective, I guess that depends on your conception of ethics, because if you believe that if your worldview is that there is something that is ethical, capital E ethical, and this is always, the right thing to do, then yeah, I'd say that, a lot of times villains cross over that ethical line. And so that would separate them from heroes as well. Maybe they're more willing to do that. Of course, heroes also cross boundaries, and they do, we consider James Bond a hero figure, sort of, I guess maybe an anti-hero, but he crosses boundaries all the time in order to do the quote unquote right thing. So I do think that there's many times a separation other than just perspective, but I think that as we get further and further along the road of movies and TV shows, I think that line gets blurred more and more often, because it's more interesting when that line is blurred.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So I'm going to read you a definition here. Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Definition of a villain. Number 1, a character in a story or play who opposes a hero.
Yeah.
So right there, that pretty much says perspective and narrative is all that matters, based off of the number 1 definition. Yeah. Because, there's nothing about ethics in there. Number 2, a deliberate scoundrel or criminal. Number 3, one blamed for a particular evil or difficulty. Mm-hmm. Based on those 3 definitions, is Robin Hood a hero or a villain?
Oh my. Well, that's interesting, because I'm thinking back to, right back to the roots of Western philosophy. Socrates says that no one deliberately acts in an immoral way. Right, so now there have been endless and necessary counters and arguments about that whole debate. But if we take that, and Socrates says that those who commit immoral actions aren't bad; they just lack knowledge of what is good and right. Well, Robin Hood was, we probably argue in our Western training, moral. He was defying the law, but the law itself was established by an immoral being, and so he was acting under what he had a duty to do, not necessarily what the standard law of the moment said was right.
Right. So that comes back to what we were just saying about how ethics is really kind of the determining factor. Because I mean, like James Bond is a good example, right? If you could, or any anti-hero really, if you're thinking about an anti-hero or an anti-villain, then really perspective and narrative is what plays into it. But ethics, ethics is a part of it. And this is kind of what Norm and I were talking about last week is what's more important, the intentions or what gets accomplished in the end.
So a great example of that is Watchmen, right? So in Watchmen, you have this whole setup about going around and finding if somebody is trying to basically set up a nuclear war, right? And there's these tensions between Russia and the United States in this alternate timeline that have just gotten so out of control. And then you have the nominal villain Ozymandias, who has masterminded all these things in order to basically use one of the nominal heroes, Dr. Manhattan, to destroy destroy New York City, in order to avert a nuclear catastrophe. So yes, he kills millions of people, which we would consider that probably to be a villainous act, but he also staves off a nuclear war that would, kill countless billions probably. And so the one of the other heroes in the story, or anti-heroes, Rorschach, can't deal with that ethical conundrum. And the other nominal heroes of the story say, no, this actually, we despise how this came about, but this was the right thing to have happened, and we're not going to try to stop it. So I think that goes right to the heart of what you're saying in terms of perspective and ethics, and debating about what the right thing to do. And when pop culture gives us that dilemma, it's interesting how audiences respond to it as well.
It is. But and you say that Watchmen is a wonderful example, and we're not talking about the Watchmen TV series. I haven't seen that,
right.
But the graphic novel,
yes,
which was then turned into the movie,
yes.
It still brings me back to Kant, that you can't, when you take an act, when you do an action that has significant deleterious consequences. When you do an action knowing that it is violating fundamental, it's not doing good things. You can. Ozymandias says he's doing a bad thing in order for good consequences. Kant says the ethical people cannot do those things knowingly and still think that they have done something right. But we also have the idea of not clear thinking that's woven into that, and then that carries up through to back to our Star Wars thing. When acting aside, when young Anakin is confronting Obi-Wan and says, from his point of view, the Jedi are evil, he's being highly emotional. He's rejecting part of the tenets of the Jedi themselves. He's not thinking clearly. It could be argued Ozymandias was not thinking clearly either.
So, why do you think it is that villains tend to be more powerful than heroes? And what I mean by this is, when you look at a lot of stories that we enjoy, in many cases, there's one powerful villain and there's teams of heroes that need to defeat him, right? In Star Wars, you have Vader, and I mean, you have Palpatine, who plays a smaller role, but you have Luke, Leia, Han, Chewie, Obi-Wan, All right, Vader has a bunch of underlings, there's millions of stormtroopers, but we know that they're you can kind of brush them aside. But when it comes down to it, there's a lot of stories, Thanos and the Avengers, right? It seems like villains tend to be, on their own, more powerful than any individual protagonist. Why do you think that is the way that we tell stories?
Okay, I'll take first shot and let Ian.
Sure.
to me, there's a psychological thing going on as well as structural legalistic sense of justice. Heroes in the fairly traditional concepts of people who are willing to go a little further than everybody else to really press and maybe even break the law, but surely press the idea of justice. But there's still some constrainment on their behavior. They're still acting according to, Thor doesn't go around just demolishing everybody. Even the Hulk holds back. And we're doing the pop cultural characters, right? He doesn't Hulk smash. Yeah, but not entirely, because if he did, people would just be splats on the ground. There's always this idea of a constraint of some kind on full release of behavior, because that's something psychological where we have to be in control. With Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Well, villains don't necessarily worry about responsibility, at least not in the same ways. They will cast, as you say, millions of henchmen are totally expendable. That's okay. They don't understand goodness or generosity or justice in a sense of constraint, because it doesn't return anything on their investment of energy. They don't have to answer to the same rules. And sometimes they goad heroes and say, you know, what you really want to be is just like me, but you pretend to answer to this other code. There's a start. Ian, you want to?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to approach this question to a couple different directions than what Dad was just saying. But so for one thing, I think that the values that we ascribe to heroes have sort of changed over time. So if you look back in like the 1980s, era of Reagan, okay, the whole I'm going to go America specific here. The American ethos was all about individualism and about, the power of the individual and, eschewing the sort of, traditional bonds of society that put us together and just saying every man's out for himself, right? So hence you had heroes like Arnold Schwarzenegger, okay? Or you take like Die Hard, you got John McClane versus Hans Gruber and his entire band of terrorists, but it's one man against the world, right? Or Arnold in his movies will usually, in the end of it, he'll end up taking down like 50 people by himself, right? 50 villains by himself. So now we tend to, our society's swung back a little bit in the other direction so that more people, at least I hope, but I also think that more people see the value of, collective effort and wanting to work together as a team to do something. So hence why you see things like the Avengers or the whole Marvel and DC cinematic universes. You got these, building teams to take on villains like you were saying, Joel. I think the other component of this is that from a storytelling perspective, the bigger the threat, the more, at least from a nominal point of view, the more interesting or more tense the story would be from a structural standpoint. So when you take Star Wars, in the 1970s, the original Star Wars, the Death Star, right, this giant threatening thing that can blow up a planet. You have this team of people that got to take it down. Well, okay, so then fast forward a few decades, you've got Star Wars The Force Awakens. Well, now it's not just a thing that can, it's just a moon that can blow up a planet. Now it's a giant, the Star Killer base that could blow up an entire solar system, right? But then that's not even enough. So then you go to, Star Wars, the Rise of Skywalker, and you've got a fleet of Star Destroyers, hundreds and hundreds of Star Destroyers that have each of them a planet-destroying cannon on it. So you could go, so, it just gets more and more ridiculous. So I think that we tend to try to big up the villain as much as possible, so that you've heard that expression, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. So that it's when the villain almost inevitably fails at the end of the movie and the heroes defeat them, then it's more satisfying. Now, I don't necessarily ascribe to that view, but I think that that's what just from the structural standpoint, that's what's happening there.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good analysis, because it's like Norm and I were talking about last week. Early early comic books, right, it was mostly just, you're beating up petty criminals and communists, and it's where's really like where's the payoff in that? It's like, oh, okay, all right, Spider-Man webs up a bank robber, it's not really fulfilling. But somebody like Thanos is looking to wipe out half of life in the universe. Yes. It's like, whoa, okay, well now there's big consequences. So I think those are good analysis of it. Let's shift to the formative a little bit. Who are some of the earliest villains in human stories?
Satan. The king of Troy, Grendel and Grendel's mother, Gilgamesh is interesting because Gilgamesh gets so full of himself that everybody fears him, and so he becomes the anti-hero until he has a balance. Enkidu is created as a balance to Gilgamesh. Those would be my toss-outs on that one.
Yeah, I'll defer to you on that because you're more of the expert in that general area.
So, do you think that villains originally were primarily created to reinforce tribalism, or to teach morality, or just to move along plots of entertaining stories? And for early people, why do you think villains were created as a plot device? And the reason that I ask it that way is because we talked about last week how the term hero's overused, right? We ascribe hero status to a lot of different people. We don't really do the same thing with villains, right? There's certain people that you describe as villains, and you get very little pushback from people. But it's not like you walk around calling your typical fast food worker that messed up your order a villain, right? You don't do that. So why do you think in early human stories, what was the purpose of introducing a villain?
Well, okay, so I'm going to take something that Ian just said about the shift of individualism from the 80s, the pop culture, but take that back to the ancient. I think arguably villains were, among other things, about self-preservation, about individuality. And about power too, but Satan in Paradise Lost, Satan is challenging God, but Satan also, but part of that challenge is that he wants free will. And it, it's much more complicated than that, but that's the essence of it. It's better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. If there's this, he says, there's this individuality to preserve the individual self. I think that just zips right up into current, Loki and the Avengers kind of thing. It's always about preserving oneself no matter what, and that's why that team approach you talked about is different. Well, Gilgamesh is about showing how important and vibrant and powerful he is, and builds his grand city, and everybody's supposed to worship his oiled, muscular self, and he gets to he even pushes his rights to even have the first evening with a young wife for himself as king before a husband. Well, there's all kinds of misogyny and everything in there too, but the point is that he has overstepped so much about individuality and what he gets to have, that then the universe, upon human petition, essentially creates this better self to balance him out. I think that's what's going on. Beowulf is a rogue. Beowulf is a hero for hire who comes in when teams, armies, cultural structures, Hrothgar and his hall, they can't handle the monster. So you bring in the heroic individual who is not, we don't look great at it, and how he does his killing, and how he feels about it afterwards, and taking the rewards and so on, he goes off the path too. So there's a strange, really interesting dynamic of individuality versus collective.
Okay. Yeah. So it's kind of. What do you think? It's a sort of a combination of those three? Then, do you think that villains are created to, kind of develop some sort of sense of community against a threat, or to teach good versus bad, or to just create stories that are entertaining? What do you think that? Why do you think that they developed the way they did?
Ian, you hop in.
I mean, I think that I think it's probably context sensitive, right? So it depends on the story that we're talking about or the place and time that we're talking about. I think another aspect of it too that goes a little unmentioned is, and maybe this is why we see. So if I keep returning to Star Wars because it's just a culturally, really pervasive sort of mythos right now, but you go to a toy store and you'll find a Star Wars toy, 7 times out of 10, 8 times out of 10, the face on the box is Darth Vader, right? So I think that going back to, and now this is purely speculative, but like going back to where villains came from, I think that humans, in a lot of stories, there's an element of fantasy, right? And so sometimes maybe we want to see ourselves doing the stuff that we're not supposed to do, treading outside our norms, trying to break the rules in order to like Norm was saying, to pursue the individualism. But I think that there's that element of release too. So if we think about like how kids develop through play, sometimes you have to play the other role in order to, and maybe this ties into what you were saying in terms of teaching morality, but to learn what it's like to do that sort of thing, or to just fantasize, in a healthy way about what it would be like to be the bad guy, quote unquote. So I think that that's another piece of the puzzle that maybe goes overlooked sometimes. But yeah, I think of the three things that you mentioned, Joel, that it sort of is probably dependent on the time and place. A story that has a villain like Satan, from Paradise Lost, is very a religiously contextual sort of story, where Beowulf may not be quite as much. So it just depends, I think.
Yeah, that's I think that's really good. And this brings me back to an episode that Norm and I did on play, right? And we dove into that, and we were discussing, well, what is the purpose of play? Why is play important? Why do children do it? And basically the conclusion that we came to, which is backed up by a lot of science, not just philosophy, is that people, not just children, but people in general, need a safe place to sort of play out scenarios and simulate alternate realities. And in doing that, it can save you from making mistakes that could end up being life-threatening or, societally catastrophic. So, I think that was a good explanation, and I think that probably does explain a lot of the literary devices that were employed with villains. And I think you're right too. You look at early villains, and a lot of them do originate from religious stories, and those are obviously going to be moral teachings in morality. And okay. So I think that.
So I played Skyrim, right? And I don't know if you've ever heard of Skyrim, but I
played Skyrim.
Yeah, fantastic. So, I accidentally killed a whole village of people, right? Sort of by accident. I would never do that in real life, obviously. I would never even dream of it. But, in this RPG, I'm this lizard conqueror king who just wanders around the countryside doing what I want. So I'm pretty much a villain in my own story there. And so, even though I'm nominally the hero of the story, because you're kind of forced to be by the game at some point. But that freedom to play, I think, is one thing that definitely ties into what we're talking about.
Yeah, and Skyrim is sort of funny too, because just in terms of character choice, I'm assuming you were an Argonian.
Yes, yes.
And an Argonian is kind of one of the best character models you could play, because you can breathe underwater, you're resistant to diseases and all this different stuff. So it has a lot of perks that make it superior to other characters. But what they find, especially, I can't remember what game it was that just came out, but I think it was Baldur's Gate. They found that you could become all of these different races of characters. Some people were just choosing to be normal people.
Yeah.
And I think that says something about the stories we tell and the villains we choose. Lots of times it's real easy to see the heroes as being similar to you and to create villains that are monstrous, despite whatever powers they may have or whatever thing. And then, you think about how that plays into cultural narratives, in terms of racism or, xenophobia and these sorts of things.
Right. Or you take like Disney, okay, and the way Disney animates their villains. Ursula in The Little Mermaid, she's this, she's overweight and she has, overly done makeup on her face and she's got like boyish short hair, sort of. And so that plays into, like you were saying, misogynistic narratives, fat phobia, even homophobia in a way. A lot of people view Ursula as kind of like a drag queen type character. So I think that like you're just saying, we ascribe some of those negative cultural, the way that we, our societal biases and our prejudices and, all the isms that we have in our society get projected onto our villains, unfortunately.
Well, I think we got a Nietzschean thing going on too. I think we have reached an age in our storytelling that Nietzsche would have been proud of us about, in the sense that when he wrote Beyond Good and Evil, as it's translated in English, I haven't read it in the original German. He critiqued philosophers of past times for just supporting, adhering to this dogma of good and evil. And he just excoriated the idea of simple black and white dichotomies and treating evil and good as opposites. And so good, his morality for him was based in part, at least, on what gives people joy and developing much more complicated notions of moral systems. And so he would be saying now with something like Watchmen in the 80s or even something like The Boys, which we've referenced a couple of times. I have where the superheroes are not super heroic. In fact, quite the opposite. They're really anti-heroes. They're corporate tools, except that some of them finally find a spine and find their own sense of morality and get back to it. But we've got a lot more of that investigation of stories going on now than ever happened when I was a kid. And I think that that's actually very useful, because if we see heroes crossing lines and we say, wait a minute, that was too far, or we see villains saying things like, Ian and I talked about this before with Thanos. The thing about Thanos is there's some element of what he's doing, and Ian has pointed this out to me a number of times, but that while we don't accept it as, this is best practice, he seems to be adhering to his own larger sense of what is good for the universe.
Right.
And so that we didn't have that going on in the 60s and 70s with the heroes.
There's a band that I really like, Queens of the Stone Age, and they have a song called Villains of Circumstance, which is a play on words from Victims of Circumstance. So Villains of Circumstance. But, you think about that, and then you try to think about, well, can a villain exist in real life or only an anti-villain, right? So you think about some of the terrible characters in history. What do you think? Do you think that villains really exist? And you can use your kind of typical examples of Hitler or, Henry VIII or whoever you want. You can think of people that would be described as villains. But Villains of Circumstance, what that says is there's something outside of the people's control that's causing them to act the way that they do.
And so like a nature
psychology
versus nurture.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Can a villain exist in real life, or is it a narrative trope?
I tend to believe that yes, they can. And I can think of some contemporary examples too that I won't name here because I don't want to get too much into it. But I absolutely do believe, and I think that while I tend to fall, I do think that there's an element of both nature and nurture that goes into making someone. So you are shaped by the circumstances into which you're born, good, bad, or indifferent. But there's also something at the core of every person that influences who you develop to be as a person. And I think that if you take someone like, if you want to go to Hitler or to Stalin or to any of these typical examples of who we might consider to be a villain, I don't know how you could argue that they are anything but. I'm sure you can, and I'm sure that accomplished philosophers like Norm and like you could do that. But for me, I just think that absolutely you could call some people villains, and that's who they are. And I don't think that everybody deserves redemption.
Right.
Yeah.
So Norm, you and I talked about this in reverse last week with heroes, right?
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah. So we were saying that we created a hypothetical scenario where we said, let's say that me as an individual with no help from anybody else saves all of humanity from an alien species wiping us out, right? It's about the most heroic thing you can think of.
Right.
But let's say my entire life up to that moment was completely despicable. By anybody's measure was terrible.
Right.
Does that one act at the end make me a hero, or can you only do something heroic but never actually be a hero? So you can. This is one of the questions that we can ask in reverse, right? Let's say you're an upstanding citizen, you were a great person or whatever, and then you did something that was terrible. Does that make you a villain, or does it mean you just did something villainous?
This is an excellent question because it makes us think of the totality of, which is not a completeness of our life, what it is that we have done. Sacred texts of large religions would suggest that the worst of the worst can be redeemed, and thus must be, if they follow a path, thus that previous activity, if not nullified, is in the past of the person. It's only in the current circumstance of what the person does that ultimately counts. I know that's simplistic, but it's sort of what we're told, and then we put that up against our own stuff. So you see, I was thinking about last week because of exactly what you just described. And so, if a character is despicable me, if a character is despicable for almost an entire life, but just has that one moment of, I salvaged humanity. One is tempted to say, yeah, but why did you do that? To save your own butt, or because it's because somehow you woke up to things. And to me, philosophically, that's where the idea of beyond good and evil goes. It's the motivations why one is undertaking these acts that makes them heroic or villainous. I'm with Ian on this. I think there are people who show, whether they stumble into it and just kept going, whether they lost their path entirely, whether they had no guidance, but end up for an entire lifetime doing uniformly or almost uniformly awful things. That's what I would consider a villain with a capital V.
So there's a story by one of my favorite authors called Stephen King is the author, and I can't remember what the story is called now. It's a short story from a recent collection of his called Full Dark, No Stars.
Is it Bad Boy?
No, I don't remember what the name of it is.
Okay.
But in this story, you have this husband and wife, and they've had a family, and the husband is by all accounts, a wonderful father, helped raise the children, helped teach them to get them to college, is there for people. He acts as an upstanding citizen in the community. He's, what we would consider a really good person. And then he goes on a business trip, and his wife is looking for something in I can't remember if it's in the basement or the attic or whatever, and she stumbles across this box that's hidden under his tool bench. And in it, she finds all these driver's licenses of young women from over the course of probably a decade. And she has to ask herself, and then she goes back and says, has he been on these business trips, basically been a serial killer, gone out and kidnapped and, done horrible things to these people and saved these licenses as a trophy? And, so it's revealed eventually that, yes, indeed, that is what he has been doing. And so then she has to decide, am I going to report him? Am I going to stay with him? What's going to happen with this whole situation? So I think that goes to kind of one of those conundrums. This person who has done horrible, evil things, and yet at the same time has been like a good father or good quote unquote father or husband or all those things. I don't know. So obviously I would consider that person to be a villain because they're doing horrible things and irredeemable things. But it goes to that question of what you posed, Joel, which is, people doing these being an upstanding citizen and then doing something horrible, and where that places them on the spectrum.
Yeah, it's there's so many paradigms that you can look at it through, and we've talked on the show before about morality, ethics, utilitarianism, and it really depends on where you look at it from, on where you land. Can good acts cover up evil acts, or are you weighing it on a scale, or are you looking at just the intentions, or are you looking at just the results? And it's probably not a question we'll ever really be able to answer, but it sure is an interesting one to think about. So, all right, I'm going to circle back to the end and ask you guys again. Who are the villains that you love to hate and the ones that you hate to love? Who wants to start?
I'll throw that to you, Dad, first.
Oh, okay. The villain that I hate to love. One. I'm just going to say one. This is not the penultimate. Is Hannibal Lecter, who frightens me still. I watched the movies. I did not watch the TV show, but I read the novels, and the novels scared me more than the movies ever could. Because of the very kind of thing that you were just describing, Ian, about here's somebody who has all the social graces. He's brilliant. He knows so much, and yet he eats people. But he does aid in finding other people, but he has a motive for that too. So I hate to love the fact of Hannibal Lecter, and I think probably. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. There's so many villains I love to hate, for heaven's sake. Yeah. You love to hate the Joker. I mean, I can't help but that. When I was much younger, I certainly loved to hate Darth Vader. In the current paradigm of television iterations of such things, there's a character in The Boys, the worst of the so-called superheroes, who's called Homelander, and Homelander is the most despicable, awful creature that you could possibly imagine. So of course you have to love to hate him. All
right, Ian, who do you got?
Oh boy, this is really difficult because, like I said at the beginning of the show, villains are like my favorite. So I always gravitate to the villain. And if the villain's good, I tend to love the story. And if the villain's mediocre, I tend to think the story is mediocre. Okay, so the villain that I hate to love, I'd say would be a character called Sephiroth. And Sephiroth is a character that originally came from a game called Final Fantasy VII. And he's showed up in many different RPGs and stuff over the course of the decade, and he just recently made his appearance in the latest Super Smash Brothers game on the Nintendo Switch. But Sephiroth is he's essentially a mercenary, but he was born out of a really awful experiment that spliced his genes with an alien presence on this planet. And so he didn't choose to be the way that he is, but he basically goes insane and tries to become a god and summons a meteor to destroy the planet that he's on. And so I think that he has some really interesting motivations. And although he does many despicable things, he's somebody who, it's still easy to identify with why he chooses to do the things that he does. So on the other end of the spectrum, the villain that love to hate. Okay. So that would have to be, for me, that had to be Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars, because he's just so, there's no nuance to Emperor Palpatine. He's bad. And there's really, at least that's the way he's presented in the films. He's just there to be the evil dude, the satanic presence who loves to cackle and cause, mayhem. And he just hates the Jedi, and that's what he's about. He hates the Jedi, and he wants to be the ruler of everything. And so I think that he's a really effective villain for that, and that's why he's essentially, I would argue, the main villain of the entire franchise of Star Wars, because he's the villain. He's the ultimate bad presence in the original trilogy. He's the ultimate bad presence in the prequel trilogy. And I don't think he was planned to be the ultimate bad presence in the sequel trilogy, but that's what he became when J.J. Abrams decided to bring him back surreptitiously at the end there for the last movie. So for me, I think that, Palpatine would have to be the one that I love to hate the most.
How about you, Joel?
I think the one that I hate to love would be James Moriarty from Sherlock Holmes. For the same reasons, a lot of the same reasons you like Hannibal Lecter. And also because he is compelling. He's very, there's a lot of competition. You're always on edge when he's around Sherlock, because you think that, man, maybe he's going to outsmart him. You don't know. And as far as ones that I love to hate, I've never had a stronger reaction to any villain than probably King Joffrey from Game of Thrones.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he's the stinker.
It's awful. All right, but this was great. Hey, I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for having me.
This has been a lot of fun. I hope to have some guests in the future. Maybe you again if you have any other topics that stick out to you.
Fantastic.
But until next time, keep pondering.